if you're finding that you're still completely caught up in your thoughts and emotions, or completely lost in the practice, then go back into the body and anchor yourself in the rhythm of the breath. That is your main focus. And then just a little bit in your corner of your mind, but notice the stillness and movements. There's just 2 points I want to cover now. In this quote we're using for the practice today from Dujung Lingpa. Remember, it said, loosely relax and watch your thoughts from afar, clearly observing whatever arises. That which observes is called mindfulness. That which is observed is called movement. And resting in that state is called stillness. Identify them as such and meditate. So again, to distinguish stillness from movement, and to, whilst resting in that stillness, observing the movements of the mind. But then he goes on to say, if you meditate earnestly, stable meditative experiences of the bliss, luminosity and non-conceptuality of Shamatha will arise in your mind stream. So this is a Shamatha practice. But yesterday also we were quoting from Padmasambhava, who was describing the resting in awareness practice. And at one point in his text he said, by so doing, fine stability will arise, and you may even identify pristine awareness. And pristine awareness is, of course, nature of the mind. So when we talk about nature of mind, we can talk about two types of nature of mind. We can talk about what's called the conventional nature of the mind. And remember, we saw there yesterday that that was usually described in Buddhism as the fact that the mind is clear and knowing. So again, the conventional nature of the mind is the fact that the mind is clear, has clarity, and it is aware, it knows. But here when Padmasambhava is talking about pristine awareness, he's talking about the ultimate nature of the mind. And that is how the mind exists. And of course, the mind, like all other phenomena, according to the view of in Mahayana Buddhism or Madhyamika Buddhism, Madhyamika philosophical system, as we see in day 9, is emptiness. That also the mind is not independently existent, inherently existent. And the conventional nature of the mind, this fact that the mind is clear and knowing, is something that we will realize through the Shamatha practice. Simply by observing the mind, we really get to see this clarity and knowing qualities of the mind. Whereas to come to realize the ultimate nature of mind, emptiness, this is done through vipassana practice. Is done through investigating the mind, to search for the mind. Where is this mind that seems to be here? And if we don't find this mind, we'll come to realize that it's empty of any findable inherent existence. And that's in Vipassana. We'll be looking at that in day 9. So that's one thing I wanted to mention. And the other thing I wanted to mention is that in this practice, in the breath practice, the how to know if we're progressing is this usually this model here is presented. This 9-stage model, we go through 9 stages of progress. And we'll look at the first 4 stages this evening, and then the rest we'll look at tomorrow evening. And then we saw that in the observing the mind, often a 4-stage model is used. This waterfall, the fast-flowing river, the slow-moving river, and the still lake. Here, in this practice, there is another model that is sometimes used. Which is called the 4 modes of mindfulness. The door of entry into this practice we're doing now is, as Dujung Limpa says, identify them as such and meditate, meaning to be able to distinguish stillness from movement. So that is the door of entry into this practice. And then if we practice on that basis of resting in stillness, observing the movements of the mind, then the first stage of progress is called single-pointed mindfulness. And that is when we are simultaneously aware of stillness and movement. That's single-pointed mindfulness. And then if we keep practicing, the next stage of progress is what's called manifest mindfulness. And that is that now less effort is required. It becomes a bit of a flow, that we're more easily able to rest in stillness, observing the movements of the mind. It really starts to flow well, less effort. And then if we keep practicing, then at the higher levels of this practice, the third stage is what's called absence of mindfulness. Oh, sorry, 4. I'm jumping ahead. I'm already gone to 4. So absence of mindfulness here doesn't mean mindfulness is gone. But what this means is, and we'll see this in a little bit more detail tomorrow evening when we are looking at the higher stages of this model. But I've already briefly mentioned that as we progress towards Shamatha, this threshold that I've talked about between conscious and unconscious keeps moving down. And as a result of that as well, our sense faculties start to slowly shut down, and that coarse mind becomes more subtle. And I said that we get right down to that bottom of that bandwidth, and then when we achieve Shamatha, we go into the subtle level. But just before we do that, when we get right down to that bottom of that bandwidth, the coarse mind is really becoming dormant. And that is absence of mindfulness. Here, we're talking about the fact now that the mind, the sense faculties have become dormant, and the mind is becoming much more subtle. So it really means absence of coarse mind. And then the next stage is when we actually achieve Shamatha. Which is called self-illuminating mindfulness. And this illuminating here means that now is the same word as here as clarity. Now we are resting in those three qualities. So remember those three qualities we talked about. Three qualities of clarity, non-conceptuality and bliss. So now once we've got into that state of shamatha, self-illuminating means now our mind is crystal clear. Non-conceptual meaning that it is become completely still, there's no activity, and our mind is very blissful or joyful. So that self-illuminating mindfulness is at that stage of then achieving shamatha. So this is sometimes a model that's used in this practice to describe the stages of progress. And we can sort of roughly correlate these four with this 9-stage model, which we haven't really looked at yet. But the first one, single-pointed mindfulness, is more or less roughly the first 3 stages. Manifest mindfulness sort of starts from about stage 4 up to about 8. So this is about 1 to 3 roughly. Manifest mindfulness 4 up to 8 roughly. This absence of mindfulness is stage 9 more or less, is when the sense faculties really go dormant and the coarse mind really goes dormant. And then, of course, self-illuminating is the shamatha. But this is just a rough approximation, and we'll look at these 9-stage model. We'll start to look at that this evening. And we'll look at the first 4 stages and then the other stages tomorrow evening. So there is that sort of rough approximation there. And similarly, actually, while we're on that point, there is on page 3, there are 9 stages leading to shamatha. So remember we briefly talked about that other 4-stage model, the waterfall of thoughts, fast-flowing river of thoughts, slow-moving river of thoughts, and the still lake. And that's described in the last column here. And so we can see this waterfall of thoughts is roughly equivalent to the first 3 stages, so a little bit similar to this. Then we see that the fast-flowing river of thoughts is roughly equivalent to stage 4 and 5. And then the slow-moving river is 6 and 7, and then really the still lake is 8, 9, and then into shamatha. But we'll look at that again tomorrow evening. So there are a number of models that are used in the various shamatha practices to describe the stages of progress, but the most common one is this 9-stage model, and will be... Right, what? Sorry?
Threshold.
Threshold. Oh, the word?
Yeah, how
you don't know. Threshold. So that's all I wanted to mention now. So we'll go back into the practice now, and actually this time we'll just do one 20-minute session. And I'd just like to add one more thing to this practice now, is as we saw with the mind practice of observing thoughts the other day, the day before yesterday, sometimes when we're observing, we sort of don't notice very much the more subjective things like emotions and moods and so forth. So in this practice, we'll pay closer attention to those so we don't miss them. So same practice again, stillness in motion. If you're getting caught up in the thoughts and so forth, more emphasis on stillness. If you're becoming very dull, more emphasis on movement. So same practice, but in this practice, paying particular attention to any sorts of emotions or mental afflictions, any sorts of reactions that are coming up in the mind, because often we sort of miss these. Okay, so let's do that practice, and we'll do one 20-minute session. Begin as always by preparing the body. Breathing flowing naturally and effortlessly. And bringing the mind into the present moment. And simply becoming aware of the rhythm of the breath. Resting your gaze in the space in front of you. And again, we begin by establishing the basis in stillness. So simply allowing the mind to come to rest. And simply resting in awareness itself. Simply knowing that you're aware. And now, whilst resting in that stillness of awareness, start to become aware